Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, today I wanted to follow up on my last video where I discussed the issue of whether the Chinese government made the right decision in opening up to the extent that it did, abandoning its dynamic zero COVID policy. Of course, those who made that decision think it was, and many others in China do, such as the author of this editorial in one of China's English language media outlets, CGTN. And by the way, either he or whoever translated the article into English could use a good editor, and I'm available. But in a nutshell, my conclusion last time was that the changes China made in its policies, absent any other changes that would sufficiently offset the loosening of restrictions that took place, would result in such a massive increase in rates of infection that a skyrocketing level of deaths was the likely outcome. Because, it's just basic math. Even though China likely has a lower fatality rate from COVID than most countries, certainly than my home country, the United States, due to its very high vaccination rate, its near universal mask wearing, quite unlike the United States, which not only prevents a lot of infections, but also reduces the viral load of people who do get infected. Perhaps the use of some medicines, traditional Chinese medicines that aren't used in the West, maybe that could be very helpful. But, no matter what, you can't make policy changes that result in an increase in the infection rate by several orders of magnitude, as these changes undeniably have, without also seeing a massive increase in the number of deaths. Because, as I pointed out last time, the Chinese CDC's own chief epidemiologist, Wu Zhengyu, predicted that China would have several million infections this winter and estimated the infection fatality rate at between 0.09 and 0.16%. Let me get down to that. So he said around 10 to 30% of Chinese people will get infected this winter. And from what I've been hearing, it's actually likely already higher than that, with my friend Jerry Gray, who lives in China, reporting that things went from almost nobody he knew having been infected with COVID to most of the people he knew who he had talked to over the last couple of months having been infected with COVID. So Wu said around 10 to 30% of Chinese people will get infected this winter, so that we're talking 140 to 420 or so million people, which it's probably higher than that by now. And the fatality rate will range from 0.09 to 0.16%. So if you do the math on that, it works out to somewhere between 100,000 and 700,000 deaths approximately. So it's not exactly just Westerners who expected that we would see China have a huge increase in its number of COVID deaths if it relaxed its COVID policies to the extent that it has, where they're no longer engaging in massive testing of millions of people in a city to track down every single infection. They're no longer having people carry a code on their phone app that has to be green, meaning they have tested negative recently and haven't been exposed to anybody who tested positive. They used to, during zero COVID, have to show that green code in order to go a lot of places. But they're not doing that anymore. They're really basically at this point, what China is doing is just encouraging everybody to wear a mask, which most everyone still does. But people still do things like dining in at restaurants where obviously you can't wear a mask. Most everybody is vaccinated. Well over 90% have been vaccinated, fully vaccinated. I think the last figure I saw was about 60% boosted, and the full vaccination rate is upwards of 95% in some of the major cities. Um, but nonetheless, if you have so many infections, then you're going to have a huge increase in the number of deaths. That was the expectation of Wu Zhongyu. And that expectation, unfortunately, has now been confirmed. So, nearly 60,000 COVID related deaths reported in China in the past month, the Global Times says, relaying information from the National Health Commission. Um, and this is in mainland China. There have also been thousands of deaths in Hong Kong and in Taiwan in recent months. Both of those provinces of China are governed separately. So 60,000 people, approximately, is more than 10 times as many people as have died of COVID in mainland China during the entire nearly 3-year period that China pursued zero COVID from sometime in January 2020 when it locked down Wuhan up until mid-November or so of 2022, where you had a bit over 5,000 deaths from COVID in mainland China. So, according to Chinese public health officials, there's the exact figure they gave there, 59,938. Let's see, where is this information? So according to Chinese public health officials, the number of hospitalizations peaked on January 5th at 128,000. Different articles that I've seen refer to this as either severe cases or hospitalizations, but they're basically counting how many people have been hospitalized. So for comparison, in the U.S., which has a bit under a fourth of the population of China, the peak hospitalization rate we had here was a bit over 150,000 people during our major Omicron wave that peaked in January of 2022. So, pretty similar hospitalization numbers in China at the peak, but obviously China's a much bigger country. Now, based on statistics from other countries' major waves, such as the one in the U.S., where the peak rate of infections was in, I think, mid-January of 2022, and then the peak in deaths was roughly 3 weeks later. So based on statistics from other countries' major waves, we should be seeing a peak in the number of deaths in China right about now, probably yesterday, January 15th. If that's the case, then we can expect that by the time this wave is over, that 60,000 deaths that we've seen so far will at least double. And you note that Wu and other Chinese scientists are not expecting this wave to be the last one. Rather, Wu said, for example, let's see, I've got to switch back to that article. The mainland will likely be hit by 3 more waves of COVID infections in the coming months. Large cities are already facing the first wave, which began in mid-December and will continue till mid-January. So, infection rates have come down considerably from their peak in late December, but deaths lag a bit. So, it's impossible to say what the final impact will be. But suffice it to say that this is going to be a rough winter in China, with perhaps a couple 100,000 deaths, at least in mainland China, on top of who knows how many thousands of deaths there will be in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Macau. Hong Kong and Taiwan, respectively, have had about 13,000 and 16,000 deaths so far, which, I mean, they're not obviously anywhere near as populous as China as a whole. So that's a lot of deaths, lower than the death rate in the U.S., but nowhere near as low as mainland China, because both Taiwan and Hong Kong abandoned their zero COVID policies almost a year before the mainland did. Okay, I'd like to point out something here that you said that it was a bit problematic. He said that the policy adjustments that China made were rolled out when the number of deaths per week globally had hit the lowest level and stayed below 10,000 for consecutive weeks. Now, if you look at the figures on COVID deaths worldwide, you see that's not actually the case, according to these figures from the Worldometer website. So this is average daily deaths, so you have to multiply by 7 to get the weekly average. So on June 17th, the 7-day moving average was at its lowest point at 1,340. Multiply that by 7, and indeed you get less than 10,000. But if you look at sorry, I can't seem to do this. Anyway, never mind that. If you look at the fall here, I'll just tell you that there's no point in the entire fall or early winter when worldwide COVID deaths were below 10,000. So this is just a factually incorrect statement here. The only time during the entire pandemic, aside from early 2020, when COVID hadn't spread worldwide yet, that the rate of weekly deaths fell below 10,000 was those couple of weeks that you see there on the graphic in June of 2022. So, I'm a bit puzzled as to why he said this, unless he's just going by a different data set than the ones that I've seen. I'd also like to call your attention to some statistics where they break down the deaths over that 5-week period, 59,938 deaths. They say 5,503 were due to respiratory failure caused by the virus, and 54,435 were from underlying conditions interacting with epidemic infection, according to the National Health Commission. Now, some people I've seen take that to mean that most of China's reported COVID deaths were not actually deaths from COVID, since other conditions contributed to their deaths. But that reflects a misunderstanding of how deaths from diseases work. Because, in fact, it's quite typical for people who are said to have died of this or that serious malady, such as cancer or heart disease, to have also had other serious underlying conditions that contributed to their death. That doesn't mean they didn't really die from heart attacks or cancer or strokes or diabetes, etc. Um, but that what it means is they wouldn't have died had they not had those other conditions. But they also, uh, they had serious underlying health conditions, but they might very well have lived with those conditions. Let's say heart disease or cancer, a bit longer if they didn't have other things going wrong. So, you know, somebody who has high blood pressure or asthma or emphysema, could very well live many years with serious conditions like that. But if they get COVID, then the combination of those conditions could kill them. Even though if they were perfectly healthy and they got COVID, there's a good chance that they wouldn't have died. Anyway, back to the main point that I'm making here. As a result of the policy changes that China has made, it faces a much more serious public health situation than it did a couple of months ago. And it isn't just the deaths. We're talking about hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of people having gotten seriously ill enough to have been hospitalized over the past month and a half or so. And as I was saying the other day, COVID can quite often cause other health problems in the long term, not just when people have an active infection. So, have a look here. Let's see. At least 65 million individuals around the world have long COVID, that condition that I was talking about the other day, where you have severe symptoms for an extended period of time after you no longer test positive for COVID. So, like a month or two afterwards, a lot of people start having these symptoms. Things like, let me click on the article here so we can take a closer look at this graphic. Here's a list of the possible symptoms you can have with long COVID. You can have damage to your heart, cardiac impairment, myocardial inflammation, POTS, which I forget what that stands for. Long-term lung symptoms, declines in the immune system's functioning, or autoimmune diseases, diabetes, problems in your gastrointestinal tract, neurological impairment, cognitive impairment, fatigue, sleep disorders, memory loss, tinnitus, which is ringing in your ears, damage to your kidneys, damage to your blood vessels, strokes, reduced sperm count, erectile dysfunction. These are all common symptoms that people who develop long COVID can have. Okay, well, how common is long COVID? Here's a British study that compared people who were infected with the Delta variant of COVID to people infected with the Omicron variant. So, the narrative is that Omicron is mild, etc., but is so much more infectious that it still causes a huge number of deaths. More than 250,000 people died from Omicron last year. And it still causes a significant number of people to develop long COVID. So, whereas approximately 10% of people who were infected with Delta wound up having long COVID for anywhere from a few weeks to a few months or even years after they were infected with Delta. Uh, about half that number, 4.5% of people who had been infected with Omicron developed long COVID. So, even though, quote unquote, only maybe 5% rather than 10% of people are uh, getting long COVID if they're infected with Omicron, when you have huge numbers of people getting infected, it adds up to a lot of people. So, let's say that half of people in China wind up getting COVID this winter. I don't know what the exact number is going to be, and as I said before, it would take some random sample tests, probably random sample antibody tests, and some people will no longer test positive on a PCR test that have had COVID. Um, yeah, if they do that, they'll be able to figure out exactly what the proportion of people in China who got infected with COVID uh, is. In any case, let's just say it's half for the sake of argument. Now, if that's the case, if 700 million people get uh, Omicron over the course of the winter, we're talking about upwards of 30 million people in China who are going to have, a long-term illness as a result of COVID with the symptoms that I just showed you a few minutes ago. And some not insignificant portion of those people are going to be too sick to continue working, attending school, etc. And some of them are going to die prematurely. And deaths attributed to COVID are only those that occur while you're infected with COVID. That's the way they do the statistics. But the fact is that getting COVID may kill someone later than that due to the conditions they develop, such as diabetes or heart disease or dementia, what have you. And it greatly increases your risk of developing other health problems. And I get the sense that a lot of people in China, like many people here in North America, seem to be under the impression that COVID is basically a one and done sort of thing. They seem to be hoping and assuming that China's high vaccination rate. Let me switch back to me here. In combination with most people having been infected with COVID by the end of the winter, is going to result in herd immunity. That, almost everybody in China is going to have some degree of immunity from COVID. And assuming, okay, well, now we can go completely back to normal and forget about all this pandemic stuff once we've made it through the winter. But, that isn't the way that this works. The whole reason that we're here 3 years into the pandemic and still have massive numbers of COVID infections worldwide, even in places like China with a more than 90% vaccination rate, the reason is that the virus has evolved so that it can still infect people who have been vaccinated and even boosted and or have already had COVID. Because Omicron is extremely immune evasive, and most of the vaccinations people have had have not specifically protected against Omicron. It's been estimated that right now almost 40% of infections with COVID in the UK are reinfections of people who have already had COVID before. So it's simply not the case, in all likelihood, that China will be out of the woods after this rough winter. So, look at what's happened in Hong Kong. And for comparison purposes, I've shown the death rate for the United States there. Now, Hong Kong follows zero COVID policy like mainland China for basically the entire first couple of years of the pandemic. Then, in approximately February of 2022, they abandoned zero COVID and simultaneously were hit with an Omicron wave. And, you think Omicron is mild? Well, look what it did to Hong Kong. They had perhaps the highest death rate of any place on the planet at any time for a brief period of time. And that was with, I believe at the time they had something like a 70% vaccination rate. And by the way, that's about where the UK's is currently. It's something like 75%. So, let's see why. Almost 40% of infections in the UK are reinfections of people who have already had COVID before, and that's even with a lot of people already having been infected with COVID before, and about 75% of people in the UK having been vaccinated, and I take their percentage of people who've had a third shot or more is even higher than China's. But going back to Hong Kong, after they got through that massive wave where probably most people were infected and they had a huge number of deaths because their vaccination rate was actually quite poor among the elderly. They went back through a period where they had very little COVID cases and deaths for a while, but then this winter things have spiked again, where Hong Kong has even a higher death rate than the United States, which I've put on the graph there for comparison purposes. So it's more than 4 times as high a death rate right now as of mid-January. And you might think getting reinfected with COVID wouldn't be such a big deal because you've got the immunity from both being vaccinated and having had COVID before, but turns out that's not necessarily true. Because repeat COVID infections increase the risk of organ failure and death. According to a number of studies. So here's a study, and granted, I believe this is a study that looked at U.S. veterans who obviously are, an older population. But look what happens when you get reinfected with COVID. The rates of every possible disease you could have, or a lot of diseases, go up significantly each time you get infected again with COVID, and the rate of hospitalization increases. Now, granted, this was a specific population, and it may not work exactly like this with younger and or healthier people, but still, there's a risk there that the next time you get infected with COVID, which you will if you're not wearing masks and if there aren't some other protections in place that keep the rate down somewhat, there's a decent chance you could have worse effects as a result of the second or third infection than you had with the first one. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I was not only surprised, but quite disappointed when the Chinese government completely abandoned zero COVID back in November, and then even more so in December and January. The government referred to its previous policy as dynamic zero COVID, which they stressed meant that they could make big changes in a policy, radical changes perhaps, to the approach to containing COVID, such as, for example, only engaging in mass testing in areas of a city where there are known to be cases rather than testing a whole city, but still achieve the same goal of keeping cases very low. And they chose to just give up on finding ways to keep cases low. Uh, and some people have said, well, it's a myth that they're just letting it rip. They haven't abandoned containing COVID to that extent. Um, but, I mean, they're no longer taking major steps at a governmental level to keep case levels low. Granted, they're recommending that people wear masks, and almost everyone still does, unless, for example, they're doing something that requires not wearing a mask, such as dining in a restaurant. And you do have the very, very high level of vaccination. But uh, there's not an effort to contain infections other than steps that people are taking on their own, and the government's strongly encouraging everyone to be vaccinated and wear masks. And I can certainly understand. After 3 years, people got very tired of lockdowns if they experienced them, though the majority of Chinese citizens never have been locked down. And people got tired of having to show a green code on their phone app to go places and so forth. But I think it's time to think outside the box and consider whether there's maybe another way to dynamically achieve zero COVID, i.e., a consistently low level of infections, while still having things pretty open. Because there's no way that allowing for a high number of infections to take place is going to turn out well. I don't care how good traditional Chinese medicine is, which I don't really know much about it, but let's say it works well and reduces the death rate from COVID or severe illness rate from COVID by an appreciable amount. And regardless of how high the vaccination rate is, unless we can come up with a vaccine that is sterilizing, meaning that it just snuffs infections out the moment they get into your nose and mouth. We're not at that point yet. So if you don't do things to mitigate infections in the first place, even beyond just everybody wearing a mask, because masks aren't perfect, and people aren't perfect about wearing them, you're going to have a high rate of infections. Now, one thing we know about COVID is that the overwhelming majority of the infections take place indoors. It's pretty rare for people to be infected while they're outdoors. They can get infected outdoors, but the overwhelming majority of infections occur in public indoor spaces, or if somebody brings it home to you from somewhere in public, you can get infected in your house. So if we go back to the olden days, when waterborne diseases like cholera were very commonplace, what was the problem there? The problem was that the water was dirty. It was full of viruses and bacteria and other stuff that made people sick. So the reason why, in most of the world, not all of it unfortunately, but in most of the world, waterborne diseases are not a problem to a significant degree, is that we cleaned up the water. Because that's what the problem was. The water was dirty. So, we've got to think about the task ahead of us with COVID and other airborne infectious diseases as being similar. We need to clean indoor air. Vaccines are great for protecting us from severe illness, but they don't do that much to prevent infection now that Omicron is here. And wearing masks is great for preventing infection, but obviously, even though everyone, or the vast majority of people in China wear masks in the vast majority of public indoor spaces, that hasn't been enough by itself to prevent mass infection, hundreds of millions of people getting infected. Nobody's going to wear masks at home unless somebody else in their household is known to be sick. And lots of people live in apartment buildings with indoor hallways. You can't wear a mask while you're eating at a restaurant, so I'd suggest to you don't until we're done with the pandemic. Um, so we need to think of ways to treat indoor air for contaminants, just as we do the water. If we can manage to get the viruses largely out of the air, we'll be able to contain not only COVID, but every other airborne infectious disease as well. And there are several ways to do this. We can improve buildings' ventilation systems. We can get air filters or make them ourselves with furnace filters and box fans, so-called Corsi-Rosenthal boxes. And I'll try to remember to put a link to information about that in the description this time. But an even more effective, although more expensive alternative, is far UV light. So let me just show you some information about that. I'll link to this article. Ultraviolet and indoor air disinfection to fight pandemics. So basically the idea, I'm not sure if I highlighted anything in this article, but basically, in addition to the more than 20 million excess deaths attributable to COVID-19 so far, acute respiratory infections generally are among the 3 main causes of death and disability worldwide, accounting for nearly 4 million deaths per year. So viruses such as RSV, influenza, rhinovirus, adenoviruses, do in fact kill millions of people a year, and we're doing that, worldwide, and we're doing that before we had COVID. And then, interestingly enough, when we had restrictions on COVID, even in countries where it wasn't to the same extent as in China. So, for example, even in the United States, hardly anybody was getting the flu during the first year and a half or so of the pandemic, because we did have significant lockdowns here for a brief period of 2 or 3 months, and the more highly infected places like New York City, we had widespread mask mandates. And I got to tell you, as an American, when the most individualistic society in the world, a lot of people didn't wear masks even when they were required. But still, it was like 75% of people in places I went were wearing masks. So that helped a lot with keeping down rates of infections with flu and colds and so forth. Didn't do as much to keep down infections with COVID because obviously we were not as strict as China, for example, was, but they did a lot. So anyway, turns out that this UV light, let's see, go to the second article. It would require a big investment. I don't know if it's trillions of dollars, as they mention here, but probably billions of dollars would be necessary as an investment to install ultraviolet, near ultraviolet light in public indoor spaces and have them at home and so forth. It's extremely effective at killing viruses. Is actually more effective in killing viruses and bacteria than filtering the air or having good ventilation is. Well, ventilation doesn't kill them, it just disperses them. But anyway, so I think if China can afford to make such a massive investment as it has and will continue to do in renewable energy and energy efficient ways of doing things, such as using high-speed rail for long distance travel rather than being as reliant on cars and planes as we are here in the United States, making buildings more airtight so that and insulated so that it costs less to heat and cool them, things like that can do a lot to fight climate change. Also, as I think I've mentioned before, Reducing our consumption of animal products would help a huge amount because animal agriculture is very damaging to the climate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation and so forth. But China is doing a lot to and investing a huge amount of money in measures that fight climate change. So surely China or any country with a political will to do so, which hopefully someday will include my country, uh, they can do the same thing and make a big investment in cleaning indoor air to combat the scourge of airborne infectious diseases like COVID, uh, influenza, etc. We don't have to choose between inconveniencing ourselves by having to show our test results everywhere we go and so forth, and letting massive numbers of people get sick. We can have the best of both worlds if we invest in cleaning the air. And I hope that countries will start doing that. And, we can also do it on an individual level to an extent. Having air filters in our homes. If you've got a little more money, you can get a near, is it near or far? Anyway, it's the right way of living of UV light. We can do a lot to combat airborne infectious diseases like COVID and so forth, and perhaps permanently get past the scourge of infectious disease pandemics. Okay, that's all I have for today. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.